Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Sunday evening Bible study. This week, we're going to start a study in Ecclesiastes. Jacob and I were talking about what it was we were wanting to study next after coming out of studying things like angels falling from heaven and whether the Nephilim were giants or children of angels.
Yes.
We thought we would get into something that's most people would agree is maybe a little more life applicable, though there are applicabilities to be taken from those lessons.
Definitely.
So we've decided that we're going to spend some time in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is something that I've enjoyed reading throughout my life, and we'll get into some reasons for that later. But if you read through it, there's a lot to be taken away from for the perspective of our lives as it relates to our day to day, what we pursue, whether it be in work and leisure with family, and then also what we ought to be pursuing, which is life lived for God.
Yeah, and Ecclesiastes oftentimes, probably chapter 3, the timing stuff is used, in our culture, in media, and all kinds of stuff so often. But the whole of Ecclesiastes gives us so much more, I think, than just those few verses that we often like to take out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being able to look at, what the writer actually said before. I'm going to say the writer because I think we're going to get into that. But what the writer said before and after chapter 3 is just as important as what he said in chapter 3.
Yeah. And if you're not familiar with the song that comes from chapter 3, Jacob may or may not sing it for us in coming weeks. So stay tuned for that.
We'll see.
But as we get into Ecclesiastes, and Jacob just alluded to this, the very first verse of chapter 1 says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." Now, I think just for reading that, most people could quickly come away with, well, this is Solomon.
Yeah.
And Solomon is most often attributed as the writer of Ecclesiastes. Now, one thing to note is that both in chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 12, verse 9, at the very end of the text, Solomon is referred to in the third person.
Yeah.
Right? He's being called the preacher. So there is some debate as to whether Solomon actually wrote this or whether it was someone penning it on his behalf. Because if he wrote this, he's referring to himself in the third person. Again, not naming himself, but naming himself in the sense, hey, son of David, king of Jerusalem.
Which isn't uncommon. John constantly refers to himself as the one who Jesus loved.
Right.
Solomon has maybe a little more wisdom, right, than John, so that's why he still may, refer to himself in the third person.
Right.
He isn't.
Right. But generally, both from the descriptive statement in verse 1 and then also what is said all throughout the text, you can take away from it that this is Solomon.
Right.
The significance of this being Solomon in writing this text, and again, we're going to get into what he talks about in just a moment, but the text is so much focused on the lessons learned by the writer from all of his experiences in life, and basically boiling it down to that life is nothing if it's not lived for God. And the significance of that coming from Solomon is that we think about what Solomon had and what he was. He was a wise king, the wisest of kings,
right,
as blessed by God. We're not going to turn over there, but 1 Kings chapter 3, if you recall, God comes to Solomon in a dream and says, request of me what you would like. And Solomon basically says, look, I'm young. I got to rule these people of yours. Give me wisdom. And it pleased God that he said that. And so it says God gave him wisdom such that there would be no other king like him while he lived, as far as with his wisdom. Also gave him great riches.
Yeah.
Solomon's rule was a time of peace, right? The kingdom, his father David had taken care of their enemies, and Solomon was able to come in and rule a prosperous, peaceful kingdom. And he was blessed by God with all of these riches and honor. And, there were dignitaries from other nations that would come see him and to hear of his wisdom and see the riches that he had.
And, the temple, right? David did all the work for the temple, but Solomon got to reap the glory of getting the temple put back up.
Yeah, absolutely. And Solomon got to enjoy the temple and its splendor for one of the few times that it was seen in its entirety, right? Before the destructions of Jerusalem and exiles and efforts to rebuild the temple. I mean, it was its glorious original form when Solomon built it. And so, by all measures, you had what was probably the best time for the children of Israel right here with King Solomon. Now, King Solomon, of course, made decisions that would show the weakness of flesh.
Right, of course.
Would show our tendency to pursue our own passions and get away from God's word. But at the same time, in writing this, it seems like, and we don't know at what stage of his life he wrote this. I would argue maybe later.
It seems like it. Yeah.
But it looks like the reflections of someone on a life lived that taught him lessons, and that, again, nothing matters if we're not living for God. And so for a more modern application, again, for the next few weeks as we go through this, when I read Ecclesiastes, it screams to me all the rest of these things that I worry about, whether it be my job, health considerations, what it is we're going to do in the next 6 months. While making those plans, there's some importance to those. At the same time, if we're neglecting service to the Lord for those things, then they're meaningless and they're worthless. And I think that's what we'll take from Ecclesiastes. One other thing to note, just an interesting textual note, Ecclesiastes is not quoted and or directly referenced in the New Testament. There's some texts in the New Testament that say very, very similar things to what Solomon says here. So, one might argue, well, the New Testament author was referencing Ecclesiastes. We're going to look at James in a little bit, James chapter 4. You could say, well, James was familiar with the ecclesiastical text, or it's just a theme that is very common to pursuing a life after God. But it's not something that's actually directly quoted. There's been debate through the years about whether Ecclesiastes is to be included in the canon, largely for that. I want to say there are 7 books in the Old Testament that are not directly quoted or mentioned in the New Testament, and this is one of them. So we're going to start reading through. Tonight we're going to spend time just on Ecclesiastes chapter 1. So we're going to start reading through here. Verse 2 says, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Outside of To Everything There Is a Season, turn.
Yeah.
This may be the number one thought in someone's mind when they think of Ecclesiastes. The idea of vanity, right? Because the word is used throughout, and specifically in this second verse, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This is where oftentimes our minds go when we think of this text. Jacob and I were noting a moment ago, before we started, this word in the original Hebrew was often translated breath or breathe. The idea of a mist or a vapor is sometimes carried with this word.
Yeah.
And so this idea of vanity is something that's momentary. It's something that's fleeting. In our current vernacular, vanity is more something that doesn't really carry a lot of value or weight. Right? It's meant more for appearance than it is for function or purpose.
Right.
So we can easily see a correlation between those two phrases, both the idea that something is not worth much and something is fleeting.
Yeah.
So he goes in, verse 3, he says, "What profit has a man from his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rose. The wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north, and the wind whirls around continually, and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, and the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers came, they return again. All things are full of labor. A man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing." We're going to stop there just for a moment. So it's interesting to me, Jacob, that he sets initially the stage of our life in the grander stage of the cosmos.
Yeah. Looking at how, and so much we think that everything is revolving around us, to get your mind to the point where actually the world is going on without you, whether you're there or not, whether what's going on in your life is happening or not. These things are still going to happen. And so often I think we get to the point where we think every action is so linked to us that we forget about the big picture, about what else is going on in the world. So I think he does a good job of starting this out, of the point he's trying to get to. He doesn't waste any time saying, look, the world is going on. It's bigger than you. It's going to go forward. Generations are going to come. Generations are going to go. Stuff is going to continue to happen. And that he's not, minimizing what you're supposed to be doing. He's minimizing your view of yourself, right? And trying to get you to a place of where that's more along the lines of God's view.
Yeah, absolutely. couple of things that I love here, and again, part of the reason I love this text so much. You look at what gets said in verses 6 and 7. He does nothing short but describe our jet streams around the world, right? Yeah. He understands that the wind goes around on a circuit. As a kid, I thought that the trees moving made the wind blow. So I was a little bit lacking in knowledge there. But Solomon understood that the world has a flow to the wind, high pressures and low pressure systems. He also understood the water cycle, something that we learn about probably in 3rd or 4th grade. Yeah. Right? I like the way he notes it. He says, all the rivers flow to the sea, yet the sea doesn't fill up. Yeah. And he's just pointing out that there's a cycle to everything. And we find ourselves in the middle of this cycle. And as Jacob pointed out, we so often think that the world revolves around us. Mm-hmm. It's that whole old adage, you don't think about your big toe until you stub your big toe, and then it's all you can focus on. Yeah. Well, you don't think much about the world when all you're doing is focusing on your piece in it and the super important thing that you must do that day. And this is not to diminish the super important things that you all do every day. But it is something to consider that so often those things that we worry over, those things that we invest hours into, if they don't get done, sometimes it doesn't matter. If they're done and done incorrectly, sometimes it doesn't matter because it's a very small thing in the bigger picture.
And I think, just the point of which we're assuming this is Solomon, I think whether it's Solomon writing it, it's Solomon's words, Solomon's thoughts, regardless. And the most wise man who's ever lived, who's towards the end of his life reflecting on all the wisdom that he's had and what he's seen, the first thing he wants you to realize is vanity, and the world is going on, and all these things are continuing to happen, and it's not relying upon you for these things to happen. Mm-hmm. And that's how he wants to start off his last words to people. Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, how many of us have told young children? I know I've told this to mine. The world doesn't revolve around you. Right. I know you think your world is crashing down, but this is but a brief bump in the road that you're facing. I think Rachel uses the phrase, "Is this a disaster or a disappointment?" when our kids are falling apart. Right. And again, when we look at the world in that context, so many things that we think are disasters are disappointments in our lives, and they're bumps in the road. And ultimately, there's something more to live for. Mm-hmm. I also want to note what he says in verse 4, and he's going to continue this thought later on. So we're backing up a little bit. He says, "One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever." It's interesting when you consider what it is that we remember about previous generations. Yeah. So I asked Jacob earlier, and I can't do this. I can't give you the names of my great grandparents. And that's I'm their direct descendant, right? And I don't remember, what is that, 3 generations back past my parents, and I can't remember that far back. So there's this idea again, and we're going to get to whether this encourages you or depresses you later. But there's this idea again of what we're doing is not going to be remembered. Right. I'm going to put Jacob on the spot. We didn't prepare this part, but Jacob, do you know who Percy Spencer is?
I don't.
Okay. No. I'll reveal that later. But the fact that we don't know who Percy Spencer is ought to tell you that people forget things, right? Yeah. That you might do some great thing and no one's going to remember you. Again, lending itself to the idea that we need to be living for God. Let's pick up back with verse 9. He says, "That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, 'See, this is new'? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after." We'll stop briefly right there. I was listening to a podcast recently, and it was a gentleman talking about, he was an investor in several tech startup businesses. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about that people will come to him with an idea, and he'll immediately think, well, this idea is not new. It's a new application of an old idea, right? That things have been done for generations that we're just now applying technology to, right?
Yeah, I heard something similar. I was listening to a podcast about writers for movies and TV, and they say, people come to Hollywood with these things that they think is so unique that nothing has ever happened like what's happened in their life and in their town, and they get there and people are like, yeah, we've had 4 of those come this week. Mm-hmm. Those exact stories.
Yeah, and Shakespeare wrote about that several hundred years ago, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's we all complain about, well, this is just a retread of a previous movie that we saw. Yeah. And Solomon understands that, and the grander aspect of life in the world, there's nothing that's really new.
Right.
There are new applications of things and new technologies and things that fascinate us, and there are theories that come about that have never been maybe tested and put into the words they've been put into, but at the same time, nothing is really new coming around. And Solomon's making this point by saying, again, going back to what he says in verse 4, there's no real remembrance of what's happened. We talk about the importance of knowing your history. And there's that famous idea saying, I don't know who it's attributed to, that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? Because you learn from your history. Well, we've been repeating history since the beginning.
Right.
You just think about the children of Israel. How many times did they repeat their history?
Yeah.
Talk about things being cyclical. If you track the cycle of the children of Israel, even just through the minor prophets.
Yeah.
Right? They fell away. God brought them back. They pursued other gods. They fell away. They repeated their own history, and we oftentimes do the same thing.
Yeah, and similarly, on the kids connection, we've been going through these stories in the Old Testament of, Ruth, Esther, Nehemiah, Daniel, all these people, and it's this theme of there's a king ruling over them, so one of God's people rises up among it, someone tries to get them out, the person who tries to do that gets proven to be wrong, the king gets rid of them and raises the person who got up again, like even more.
Yeah.
It just keeps happening again and again and again.
I mean, we talked about last week, I guess, Daniel had to prove himself to 3 different kings.
Yeah.
3. You would think after the first time when he interpreted the dream for Nebuchadnezzar that, like, oh, hey, this guy's special.
Yeah.
But Nebuchadnezzar's own son comes along.
Yeah. I don't remember what you did.
Doesn't know Daniel. He doesn't care about Daniel until he needs Daniel.
Right.
So I made a reference a moment ago, right? So he says in verse 11, there's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance. So this is a forward-looking statement. There will not be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who are to come, right? So not only is he saying we don't remember the things of the past, he's saying you people that are coming in the future after I pen this, you're not going to remember the things that are done in your time.
Yeah.
So I asked Jacob a moment ago if he knew who Percy Spencer was. Percy Spencer is the individual credited with inventing the microwave. Right?
Pretty important guy. Yeah.
He's the guy who, post World War II, was walking past a radio array and noticed that the chocolate bar in his pocket was melted.
Huh.
I may have messed that story up a little bit, but go Google it. I'm sure Wikipedia's got a great article. Percy Spencer, yeah. So he's credited with the father of the microwave. Now I have no doubt that had it not been for him, someone would have come up with that idea in the ensuing months and years.
Probably.
But this is a technology that, Jacob, I use every day.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, if I can't microwave some chicken nuggets,
yeah,
right, I've got some hungry kids and I got to get them fed.
Yeah.
That's the quickest way to put food in the belly, right?
I will say, though, Daniel Parrish, who's a minister here, had never used a microwave until like maybe a few months ago.
Wow.
Crazy?
Wow, we should get him up here.
We should.
I will say there's something to be said for toaster ovens. I'm a big toaster oven fan myself.
Yes.
Because you can't crisp something up in the microwave.
No,
you can in a toaster oven.
And I'm a big fan of crisp.
Yeah, oh yeah. I don't want soggy breakfast casserole if it's
no doubt.
Reheat. That being said, here is a piece of technology. This is just one example, right? There's millions of these. This is a piece of technology that touches almost every one of our lives except for Daniel.
Right. Yeah.
On a daily basis. And we have no idea who invented it. I didn't know that. I use that as an example because I had to look it up.
Yeah.
Right? The same idea here. And again, we're hitting this point several times because Solomon does throughout his text.
Mm-hmm.
The super important things that we do in our lives. Anything outside of God is just something that's going to be forgotten.
Yeah.
Percy Spencer did a great thing for society, giving us the ability to make perfect popcorn in a minute. Right?
Yeah.
For our movie we can watch streaming on Netflix.
Yeah.
And nobody recalls that. And so when we think about our lives and we think about the things that we want to pursue, we need to look at it through the lens of, are we helping people?
Yeah.
Are we serving people? And that service that you render is probably not going to be remembered if we don't remember the man who invented the microwave.
Yeah.
But remembrance of the service is not what's important. It's the rendering of the service that's important. It's the fact that God sees what we're doing. God sees the life that we're leading and showing his love through action, as noted again, referencing back to 1 John. And it's a credit to us.
Yeah. Isn't that what Jesus, told us when he started out, that we are the salt and we are the light, but really we're just a reflection of Jesus. And when people see us, we're not doing it for our glory. We're not going to be remembered because of it, but God gets remembered as doing this great thing because we were able to show it through ourselves. And I think that's part of his point is not that no one's going to be remembered, which is true, but that we shouldn't want to be remembered. We should be wanting God to be the one who's remembered in this.
Yeah, I mean, you see countless examples even as the disciples are going around healing people even after Jesus is ascended. Acts chapter 9, Peter heals a man who is lame, and he says, Jesus Christ is healing you.
Yes.
It's not me, and it's giving God that glory.
Yeah.
And it's something that Solomon seems to understand. And again, this is a man who had great riches and great knowledge and all of these things.
Yeah.
And he's saying, if you don't point everything to God, then you're really just wasting your time.
Yeah.
Let's look at verse 12. It says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I commune with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness. I have gained more wisdom than all those who are before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is grasping for the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So he starts out in what we have now as chapter 1. He starts out kind of setting the scene, right? Being that of the world and the world's continuous circuits and how we just find ourselves as a small cog in the big wheel. He then goes on to talk about basically that these generations come and go, and there's not this lasting thread of human remembrance.
Right.
So it's really just putting you in that vapor space that we're going to talk about from James in a minute. And then he ends it with kind of a personal aside a little bit. He's saying, I've done this.
Yeah.
He's saying, I'm wiser than any that's been before me, and I set myself to pursue the answers to some of these things.
Yep.
And he'll expand on these answers as we go through Ecclesiastes, but after putting his heart into the work of, I'm going to try to figure out all the things under the sun and what it is that wisdom does for us. And he says in verse 18, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow.
Yeah.
Which, again, going back to the point of if you take this as a depressing text or an enlightening and encouraging text, that has a depressing tone to it, doesn't it, Jacob?
It does. It just kind of goes back to, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 even talks about how so much the wisdom of man lets you down compared to the wisdom of God, because the wisdom of man really doesn't go with the wisdom of God. Like, it's almost the opposite. And I think that's one of the things he's saying is when you gain all this wisdom of man, what men want to know, really what you'll find is there's nothing in that. As you seek the wisdom of God, that's where you start to understand that there's nothing in all this that you spent your whole life trying to grasp. So there's going to be grief in that you spent all your time and effort into grasping at things that really aren't going to matter in the end.
So I wanted to know, and Jacob just went to 1 Corinthians and cited Paul. So later in 1 Corinthians, 15, Paul starts out that chapter, basically talking about, he says, we preach a risen Savior. If Jesus Christ didn't raise from the dead, then what are we doing?
Yeah.
Right? He says, then our preaching is worthless, is actually the phrase that he uses. And towards the end of that chapter, in that context, he's again trying to show how foolish all this would be if Jesus Christ didn't actually didn't actually raise from the dead. He says,
32.
It says 30, in 32. Thank you, Jacob. He says, if in the manner of men I have fought with beasts of Ephesus, what advantage is it to me? If the dead do not rise, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And that quote is out of Isaiah chapter 22. So the point he's making here, he says, if there is no risen Savior, if there is no hope of salvation, there is no God to be served, then we just need to live our lives for ourselves and just prepare to die and be like, that's the earth.
Yeah.
And all throughout, that thread runs all throughout Solomon's text. That again, if we're not pursuing God, then what we're doing is ultimately meaningless, because we're going to pass away. There's going to be no remembrance of some great thing that we've done. Even if there is, we won't be here,
right?
So it won't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I've got one more point to make, and we're going to get back into is this depressing to you, or is this encouraging to you? If you look at James chapter 4, James shares a similar idea, and this is one that's probably very, very familiar to most of you. He says in verse 13, James chapter 4, he says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go into such and such a city and spend a year, buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil." We talked about that idea of vapor, right? And the word rendered as vanity in Solomon's text in the Hebrew is sometimes taken as breath or breathe or vapor or mist, something that's very momentary. Mm-hmm. James uses the same language here. He says, okay, you're going about your life, you're making plans. In this case, the plan is we're going to go live somewhere for a year and make a profit, right? And this is where James ties in that idea of if it's in accordance with God's will, we're going to do this thing. But in the end, we've got to be making appropriations for what is to come. This is a text that's hits home for me and for my family. So those of you who know Rachel and I very well, Jacob certainly does, we are planners. We plan everything. Yeah. If you ever talk to my son for very long, you'll realize that we are ruining his life in that way because he will say, okay, here's the plan. Yeah. He says that because we say it to him all the time. Yes. We plan bedtime, right? We line it out. Right. So for someone like me who's an ultimate planner, and I want everything to work in a certain way, and then you read this text from James where he says, look, I mean, you go and you make your plans, but ultimately if it's the will of God, those things are going to happen and they're going to work out. And if it's not, your plan had better be to serve him and serve him by serving other people. Now, to put a bow on this for this evening, I've talked to some people, and I've been of this opinion at times in my life. They say, "Well, Ecclesiastes. I mean, ultimately, it's a little dark. Yeah, it's not the most encouraging." And many people hold that opinion, and that's fine, because I do understand when you're arguing that life is meaningless, you can come away and say, "Wow, that's it's less than inspirational." You won't find that on one of those inspirational posters. No, right? One of my favorite inspirational posters, Jacob. It says. It shows a picture of a sunset, and it says, "Things are darkest just before they go pitch black." Right? That's a demotivational poster, actually. But some people read Ecclesiastes and they take that away from it. I am not of that opinion, at least at this stage in my life. I read Ecclesiastes, and it's an encouragement to me, and it's an encouragement to say, look, all this stuff that you worry about, it's not worth the effort. Sure, it's good to make plans. It's good to have a healthy approach to life. Yeah. To ensure you can take care of your family. That's direct from Jesus himself, right? We must take care of our families. But at the same time, we can't make that our pursuit. We can't make that the thing that drives us day in and day out. We've got to make our drive serving the people that are around us.
It's not. I don't think it's a coincidence in going in and looking at this that the most common phrase used by God throughout the whole Scripture is, "Do not be afraid. Do not worry." Those things, because He understands that that's going to be our nature to worry and to be afraid of things. And He continually says, "Look, if you understand who's really in control and what's really important, that worry should be able to go away, but yet we still seem to spend all of our time trying to get those things, worrying about those things, and making sure it's in order, and we've done things this way, and we're going to be remembered this way, and all those things building up ourselves. And he's like, if you would just not worry about that stuff, you would be able to understand better what is important. And I think that's part of what Solomon's trying to say here with these words.
Yep. And so, and one of the reasons it's one of my favorite texts is so often in my life, I'm looking out the window and I'm like, okay, sure, that sparrow out there has got plenty of berries to eat.
Yeah.
But what am I going to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Sure, those flowers have come up through the concrete, not planted there. Okay. But what am I going to do?
Yeah, that sparrow doesn't have a mortgage.
Right. Exactly. And he's not worried about retirement.
Right.
God gives him the food he needs.
Yeah.
And exactly what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are worrying about all these things, but you're going to get what you need. I want to end on this note. Just if you in your Bibles, if you turn back, or if your app, if you just swap back a few times, Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 9. Actually, it's verse 8, verses 7 through 9. Excuse me. It says, 2 things I request of you: deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you, and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of God. How many times do we make that prayer?
Just give me what I need.
Say, God, don't give me too much,
yeah.
that I'll say, well, I don't need God, I've got all this stuff. And don't give me so little that I'm compelled to steal, but just give me exactly what I need. Full disclosure, I don't make that prayer very often.
No, I don't think many of us.
Because I'm planning and I'm worrying and I'm saying, what's the next hurdle I have to get over?
Because if we have a little more than what we need, that's the only time we can really be secure in our minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we just have just what we need, well, there's a thought that maybe it won't be enough.
Right. And meanwhile, the Son of God walked around not knowing where his next meal was coming from, but
where he's going to lay his head. Yeah.
Knowing there was going to be a next meal to be had because God was taking care of him. And so as we wrap this up, and again, we're going to be going through this study for the next several weeks, carry with you this idea that yes, from Solomon, we get the impression that life is meaningless. It's not that life is meaningless. It's that a life led away from God is meaningless.
Yeah.
And as long as we look at our lives through the lens of we need to find ways to serve, we need to find ways to help, to love on people, to share the gospel with people. We talk about service a lot, but for Jesus, that service, those miracles, it was just a means to an end, and the end was sharing the great news about his coming.
Yeah.
Same thing for us. We need to be taking care of people, but we need to be making sure that we're sharing with those people the promise that we have while we don't think life is meaningless, because we have meaning and a purpose and something to pursue.
Yeah, it's true.
So as you go out throughout your week, carry those thoughts with you. Again, we're going to be staying in this text for a little while. Please submit comments or questions to us as you have them, and if you want to focus on a specific part of the text, we'd be happy to do it.
Definitely. And that goes with everything. We talked about a lot of things the past few weeks that we couldn't have all the answers to, right? And I think it's so interesting that we go into Ecclesiastes and someone's like, you don't need all the answers to it. Just what God is giving you to know is what you need to know. And it's not wrong to want to understand that more. But Solomon says, if you spend all your time trying to understand that, it's not going to bring you any benefit. That's what he found out.
That's right. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Hope that you're taking care of one another. If you have a need, again, let us know, let the elders know, and we'll do what we can to meet it.
Definitely. Love you guys.
Love y'all.